Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we are going to do something a little different. We are going to step away from the inbred royals and the disastrous dinner parties of the 19th century. Don't worry, they'll be back, and instead, we are going into the very deep past. We are going to try and answer a question that, frankly, sounds exhausting just thinking about it. What did early humans actually do all day? So dim the lights. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. We're going to talk about a time before deadlines, before taxes, and before anyone knew what a gluten intolerance was. It was a simpler time, yes, but it was also a very, very long time. And mostly, it involved walking. Lots of walking. Let's drift back. When we think of early humans, our ancestors, the hunter-gatherers of the Paleolithic popular culture, likes to give us one of two images. Either they are grunting brutes, constantly fighting off woolly mammoths with sticks, or they are these noble, perfectly fit specimens of health, living in total harmony with nature. The reality, of course, was much more mundane. It was less an action movie and more a very slow, very long documentary about people looking for snacks. To understand what they did all day, you have to understand their primary motivation. And that motivation was calories. Today, if we want calories, we walk to the fridge, or, if we're feeling particularly ambitious, drive to a drive-thru. For early humans, getting calories was a full-time job with zero benefits and no weekends off. So, how did a typical day begin? Well, it didn't start with an alarm clock, obviously. It started with the sun. When the sun came up, you got up, mostly because it was too cold to keep sleeping, and you were probably starving. There was no breakfast, not in the sense we think of it. You didn't get breakfast. You had to go find breakfast. And finding breakfast usually meant eating whatever you hadn't finished eating the night before, which was probably a lukewarm tuber or a piece of tough, somewhat questionable meat if the previous day's hunting had been lucky. Once everyone was awake and had collectively decided that, yes, they were still hungry, the day really began. And the day consisted of two main activities, gathering and hunting. We always say hunter-gatherer, but in terms of actual daily output, it really should be gatherer-hunter, because gathering was the real work. Contrary to what the caveman movies might tell you, early humans were not primarily meat-eaters. Meat was a luxury. Meat was what you had on a good day. Most days, you ate plants. And who did the gathering? Mostly the women, the elderly, and the children. This wasn't because of some rigid Neolithic glass ceiling. It was just practical. Gathering requires patience, sharp eyes, and the ability to not be killed while carrying a baby. So a large portion of the group would set out. They weren't running. They were meandering. They would walk for miles, scanning the ground, scanning the bushes. They were looking for everything. Roots, tubers, nuts, fruits, berries, seeds. They also grabbed things that we would consider less than appetizing today: grubs, beetles, snails, lizards. If it had calories and it didn't look like it would kill you immediately, it was going in the gathering bag. We tend to romanticize this, thinking of them plucking ripe, juicy berries in a sun-dappled glade. But the reality was likely a lot of digging in hard, dry earth with a sharp stick to get a root that tasted mostly like dirt. It was repetitive. It was tedious. It was the ancestral equivalent of scrolling through social media. But instead of dopamine hits, you were looking for starch. And the knowledge required for this was immense. This is something people often underestimate about early humans. They weren't stupid. They were incredibly smart. They just had different priorities. They had to be master botanists. A 4-year-old child in a Paleolithic tribe knew more about plant identification than most modern botanists do today. They had to know which berry was a tasty snack and which berry would cause you to die in agony 3 hours later. They had to know which roots needed to be soaked or roasted to remove toxins. They had to know that this specific leaf was good for a headache, but that other leaf was only good for, well, nothing at all. This knowledge was passed down through endless repetition, likely as they walked. So while the gatherers were out scanning the undergrowth, where were the men? They were hunting. Or, to be more accurate, they were also walking, but with sharper sticks. Hunting is the flashier part of the hunter-gatherer equation, but it was also the least reliable. When we think of Paleolithic hunting, we imagine epic battles with mammoths. And yes, that did happen occasionally. But it was rare, because mammoths are huge and they generally do not want to be stabbed. Trying to kill a mammoth with stone-tipped spears was a good way to get stepped on. Most hunting was far less dramatic. They hunted small game. Rabbits, deer, antelopes, perhaps the occasional wild boar if they were feeling lucky. And their primary hunting strategy was not strength. It was something called persistence hunting. This is fascinating and also incredibly boring. Humans are not fast. Most animals can outrun us easily. But humans have one genetic superpower. We are really, really good at sweating. Animals aren't. They have to stop to cool down by panting. Humans can dump heat while on the move. So the hunt would go like this. The hunters would find an animal, say an antelope. They would throw a spear, maybe wound it slightly, but mostly they would just start it running. The antelope would bolt. The hunters, however, wouldn't spread after it. They would just walk. They'd track it. They would jog slowly at a steady pace. The antelope would run for a few miles, then stop to rest and cool down. Just as its heart rate was dropping and it was beginning to relax, the humans would reappear over the horizon. The antelope, spooked, would run again. The humans would keep walking. This would go on for hours, sometimes days. Just a relentless slow-motion pursuit in the heat of the day. Eventually, the antelope wouldn't be able to cool down. It would overheat. Its muscles would lock up. It would collapse from heat exhaustion, not because it had been fatally wounded, but because it was simply too tired to live anymore. The hunters would catch up, find the collapsed animal, and finish it off. It was an effective strategy, but good Lord, was it tedious. It was a test of endurance and stubbornness more than skill. It required the hunters to be incredibly fit, but the actual process was just a very long, very hot jog. And then, once you'd killed the animal, you weren't done. Now you had to butcher it on the spot and carry hundreds of pounds of meat, hide, and bones all the way back to camp, while also making sure you didn't attract larger predators who actually were good at killing things. So you have the gatherers spending 6 hours walking and digging for roots. You have the hunters spending 8 hours jogging and tracking. What happens next? They all meet back up. This was the Paleolithic version of 5 o'clock. People started arriving back at the home base, which was often just a specific, somewhat sheltered spot they had chosen for the week. And now, the real work of the day, the second shift, as it were, began. Because getting the food was only half the battle. Now you had to make it edible. This is where one of humanity's greatest inventions comes in. Fire was everything. It provided warmth, it kept predators away, but most importantly, it cooked. Cooking was the ultimate caloric hack. It broke down tough fibers in plants and proteins in meat, making them much easier to digest. This meant humans could get far more calories from the same amount of food and spend far less energy digesting it. Of course, they didn't know this. They just knew that roasted meat tasted better than raw meat, and that cooked roots didn't give them stomach aches as often. So while some people worked on getting a fire going, which, let's remember, involved spinning a stick against another stick until your arms ached, others were preparing the food. Roots were cleaned of dirt. Animals were butchered. This butchery was an art form in itself. They didn't have nice steel knives. They had stone flakes. These flakes were incredibly sharp, often sharper than a modern scalpel, but they were also brittle. You had to be careful. And as the food cooked, this was the social hour. The group would gather around the fire. This was the time for gossip, for storytelling, for planning the next day, and for complaining. People have always complained. I'm sure someone was complaining that the antelope meat was too tough, or that they were sick of eating grubs. This fireside time was crucial. It's where human culture was born. Without television or books or the internet, Entertainment was self-generated. They told stories. They recounted the history of the tribe. They likely sang. They made music, sometimes with instruments. We have found flutes made of bird bones that date back over 40,000 years. We often imagine early humans as silent and grim, but they were likely a very noisy social bunch. They laughed, they argued, they shared knowledge. An older gatherer might show a younger one the subtle difference between two very similar, but very different plant fibers. A hunter might reenact how he dodged a pair of antlers. After the meal, which was eaten by hand, there was still more work. Food didn't keep. They had no refrigerators, and while they eventually learned techniques like drying or smoking meat, that was for later populations. For most of the Paleolithic, if you found food, you ate it. What you didn't eat that night had to be carried the next day, and meat spoils quickly. So people also had to spend time maintaining their tools. They'd sit by the firelight, carefully chipping away at pieces of flint or obsidian to make new spear points, knives, and scrapers. This is flint knapping, and it's a difficult, skilled task. You hit the stone at just the right angle with just the right force to knock off a flake. One wrong move and you'd shattered the core, wasting hours of work and likely cutting yourself in the process. And that was pretty much it. Once the work was done, the fire was built up, and the people would settle down to sleep. They didn't have beds. They might have used piles of grass or animal skins for padding, but mostly they slept on the ground, huddled together for warmth. Sleep was likely light. They always had to be somewhat aware of sounds in the night, though the fire and perhaps a designated watch person offered some protection. This routine, with minor variations for weather and the seasons, was the reality for over 90% of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, this is what we did. We walked, we dug, we tracked, we sat, we talked. It sounds monotonous, and it was. But it was also a lifestyle that shaped us profoundly. Our bodies are designed for it. Our brains are designed for it. We are optimized for walking long distances, for processing complex environmental data, and for social bonding around a central resource like a fire. Now you might think, well, that sounds awful. They were so poor. And they were, in terms of material goods, their only possessions were what they could carry. But anthropologists who have studied modern hunter-gatherer groups have made a surprising observation. Early humans may have actually had more leisure time than we do. When your job is simply to get enough food for the day, and food is abundant, you don't necessarily have to work 8 hours. Modern studies of groups like the Kung people in the Kalahari suggest that they only spent about 15 to 20 hours a week on what we would call work, hunting, and gathering. The rest of the time was spent socializing, resting, making tools, or playing. Of course, their leisure time was different from ours. They didn't have Netflix, but they didn't have the constant, abstract pressure of the modern world. They didn't worry about the stock market, or what their boss thought of them, or if they were getting enough likes. Their worries were immediate and concrete. Is there food? Are we safe? Is it going to rain? Their life was a marathon, not a sprint. A very, very long marathon that involved a lot of looking at dirt, but it was a marathon they were good at. It's comforting, in a way, to think that our ancestors spent so much time just walking together. No rush, no appointments. Just people on a long, slow journey across a wild world. And on that thought, let's float over to another, very different way humans found to spend their endlessly boring days. Let's talk about the time they decided to stop walking and start farming. If they thought hunting was hard work, they had no idea what was coming. So as we were saying, humanity spent about 300,000 years just walking, snacking, sweating, and sleeping. And for the most part, it worked. The skeletons we find from our hunter-gatherer days actually look pretty robust. They were relatively tall. They had decent nutrition because they ate a little bit of everything. But eventually, someone, somewhere got tired of walking. Let's float over to the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. The glaciers are pulling back. The climate is getting a bit warmer, a bit wetter. And in a few specific places, like the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, humans made a discovery. They noticed that if you drop seeds in the dirt and wait, more plants grow. Now in hindsight, we call this the agricultural revolution. It sounds very grand. It sounds like a massive step forward for human progress, but for the people actually living through it, it was arguably the greatest trap our species ever stumbled into. Because the moment you plant a field of wheat, you can no longer walk away. You belong to the wheat now. What did early farmers actually do all day? Well, if you thought hunting and gathering was tedious, welcome to the soul-crushing monotony of early agriculture. The 15-to-20-hour work week of the Paleolithic era vanished, replaced by backbreaking labor from sunrise to sunset. First, you had to clear the land. And remember, nobody had a tractor. Nobody even had a metal axe yet. They had stone axes. Imagine trying to chop down a forest, or even just clear a stubborn patch of thick brush, by repeatedly hitting it with a sharp rock tied to a stick. It took weeks. It took months. And once the land was clear, you had to break the soil. Without plows, this meant using digging sticks. Just jabbing a stick into the hard earth, over and over, to make a little hole for a seed, millions of times. And then you had to wait. But you couldn't just sit there. You had to weed. Weeding is perhaps the most universal, timeless human misery. Unwanted plants have a relentless desire to grow exactly where you don't want them to. And early humans spent countless hours hunched over, pulling up little green shoots so their barley wouldn't get choked out. They watered the plants by hand, carrying heavy clay pots of water from the nearest river or stream, trudging back and forth until their shoulders burned. Then came the harvest. You had to cut all that grain, again, with tools made of flint or bone. You had to thresh it, which meant beating the plants until the edible seeds separated from the inedible stalks. And then, the absolute worst job of all, grinding the grain. This was almost exclusively the work of women, and it was brutal. We know exactly how brutal it was, because we can look at their skeletons. The skeletons of early agricultural women are a testament to daily grinding pain. To make flour, they used a saddle quern, basically a large, slightly hollowed-out stone. They would place the grain on it, take a smaller stone, and rub it back and forth to crush the seeds. For hours. Every single day. When archaeologists dig up these women, they find knees that are worn down to the bone from kneeling on hard earth. They find lower spines that are compressed and deformed from the constant rocking motion. They had severe, crippling arthritis in their wrists and shoulders. By the time they were 30, they essentially ground their own joints to dust just to make a bowl of porridge. And the irony is, the food they were working so hard to produce was actually terrible for them. When humanity switched from a varied diet of wild plants and meat to a diet consisting mostly of carbohydrates, wheat, barley, rice, or corn, depending on where they lived, their health plummeted. They shrank. Average height dropped significantly. They became malnourished because living on a monocrop means you miss out on essential vitamins. And then there were their teeth. Oh, the teeth. I warned you we'd get to the tragic personal details. Because they were grinding their grain on soft stone, little microscopic pieces of grit and rock dust would mix into the flour. So every time an early farmer ate a piece of bread, they were essentially chewing on fine grit sandpaper. Over the years, this filed their teeth down. We find skulls of young adults whose teeth are worn completely flat, right down to the sensitive pulp. They must have been in constant, throbbing pain. Because why not double down on the misery of manual labor by making chewing a contact sport? But wait, it gets worse. Because they weren't just farming plants. They were also farming animals. They decided it would be much more convenient to keep the meat close by, rather than chasing it across a savanna. So they corralled wild sheep, goats, pigs, and eventually cows. This meant living in very close proximity to a lot of animal waste. Early farming villages were not the idyllic pastoral scenes you see in paintings. They were muddy, smelly, cramped clusters of mud brick huts surrounded by animal pens. And living cheek by jowl with livestock introduced humanity to a brand new hobby: infectious diseases. Most of the major diseases that have plagued human history, smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, influenza, are zoonotic. They mutated and jumped from domesticated animals to humans. Before farming, when humans lived in small, wandering bands, a deadly virus couldn't spread very far. The band might get sick and die, but the virus would die with them. Now humans were packed together in permanent villages, breathing the same air as their coughing pigs and sickly cows. It was a microbiological paradise. Epidemics swept through these early settlements, wiping out huge portions of the population. So to summarize the daily life of an early farmer, you wake up with a ruined spine, go out to pull weeds until your hands bleed, eat a bowl of gritty porridge that wears down your rotting teeth, and then catch a fatal case of cowpox. Of course they kept doing it, because once you start farming, your population grows. You have more babies because you need more hands to pull the weeds. And once you have more mouths to feed, you can't go back to hunting and gathering. There isn't enough wild food to support everyone. You are locked in. But out of all this misery, something else was growing. Something deeply dysfunctional. Because agriculture creates a new concept: the surplus. For the first time in history, you could produce more food than you strictly needed to survive that day. You could store grain in a big clay jar for the winter. But here is the catch about a surplus: if you can store it, someone else can take it. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone is roughly equal. If someone starts acting like a tyrant, you just pack up your spear and walk away. But in a farming village, you can't walk away. Your entire life, your survival, is tied to that specific patch of dirt and that jar of barley. So what happened? Well, some people naturally had better land, or they had a better harvest. Or, more likely, they were just better at convincing other people to give them their grain. We see the rise of the first elites. The people who realized that if they could control the surplus, they didn't have to pull the weeds themselves. These were the proto-kings, the very first members of the ruling class. They probably didn't wear crowns yet. They just had the largest mud huts and the deepest storage pits. What did they do all day? Well, mostly, they sat around and worried about other people stealing their grain. To protect their wealth, they needed enforcers. So they gave some of their grain to a few strong guys who liked hitting things with sticks. Now we have the first professional soldiers. And to justify why they got to keep all the food while everyone else ruined their knees grinding it, they needed a good story. So they started claiming a special connection to the gods. They told the farmers, "Look, I know you're tired, but the sky god told me that if you don't give me 20% of your wheat, the rain will stop. I don't make the rules, I just interpret them." Enter the first priests. You can see the dysfunction taking root. It's the origin story of every terrible royal family we'll ever discuss. It starts right here, in the dust, with one guy realizing he can manipulate a bunch of exhausted, tooth-aching farmers into building him a slightly nicer wall. And as these villages grew into towns, and towns grew into the first cities, the daily tasks shifted again. The elites couldn't just keep track of the grain in their heads anymore. They needed a system. They needed bureaucracy. Imagine the sheer mind-numbing boredom of the first accountants. Because that is what the invention of writing was actually for. We like to think writing was invented by poets trying to capture the beauty of the sunset. It wasn't. It was invented by a frustrated middle manager in ancient Mesopotamia, trying to remember how many sheep a guy named Nasser owed the temple. The earliest written tablets we have, from places like Uruk in modern-day Iraq, are just endless, tedious lists. 4 bushels of barley from this farm, 2 goats given to the high priest. To be a scribe in an early city meant sitting in the hot sun, taking a piece of damp clay and pressing a wedge-shaped reed into it, over and over again, to record other people's taxes. It was the ancient equivalent of data entry. You would train for years, memorizing hundreds of complex symbols, just so you could spend your entire adult life tallying up dried fish. But this bureaucracy allowed the elites to organize labor on a scale never seen before. Instead of just farming, people were now drafted to build things. Massive things. Temples, ziggurats, city walls. What did a commoner in an early city do all day? If they weren't farming, they were probably hauling mud. Millions upon millions of mud bricks had to be made by hand. You mix mud with straw, stomp it down with your feet, pack it into a wooden frame, and leave it in the sun to bake. Then you carry that heavy brick up a ramp to add it to a wall that is already 50 feet high. And you do this from dawn until dusk, with an overseer watching you, armed with a whip just in case you decide you'd rather be sitting in the shade. They built monuments to the vanity of their rulers. Rulers who were increasingly detached from reality. Because once the kings moved into palaces, they stopped interacting with the people who actually made the food. They surrounded themselves with servants, with courtiers, with elaborate rituals. They started insisting that they weren't just chosen by the gods, they were gods. They demanded to be fanned with ostrich feathers. They demanded that their food be brought to them in solid gold bowls. They became soft, completely dependent on the very system that was crushing the people at the bottom. It's a beautiful, ironic contrast. The men who held the titles like the mighty bull of heaven, or the conqueror of the four corners of the world, often never lifted anything heavier than a cup of wine. They suffered from gout because they ate too much rich meat and drank too much beer. They had terrible dental hygiene because they ate dates and honey all day. They were worshipped as deities, but physically, they were often pale, sickly, and utterly helpless without their staff. So as we leave the Neolithic dirt behind and step into the shaded, perfumed halls of the first great palaces, we can see the stage is set. Humanity has traded the endless walking of the plains for the endless toil of the fields, all to support a tiny group of people who are about to become very, very weird. Let's drift over to the first real empires. Let's look at ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, where the families got smaller, the power got more concentrated, and the royal family trees started to look less like trees, and more like deeply tangled, inescapable vines. Let's see what happens when a pharaoh decides that the only person pure enough to marry him is his own sister. So we've escaped the mud bricks. We've left behind the endless joint-destroying grinding of barley, and we are now floating gently down the Nile. The air is warmer here. It smells like incense and roasting meats and wet reeds. We are stepping into the grand shaded halls of the Egyptian pharaohs. When you hear the word pharaoh, your brain probably immediately supplies a specific image. You picture a towering figure dripping in gold, standing effortlessly in a chariot, smiting enemies while bathed in the glow of the sun god. They were the masters of the known world. They were the intermediaries between the mortal realm and the divine. They were, for all intents and purposes, living gods on earth. But being a living god is, ironically, a very restrictive career path. Because when you are divine, you cannot just do whatever you want. Every single moment of your day belongs to the state, to the religion, and to a schedule so rigid it would make a modern event planner weep. The daily life of a pharaoh was not a non-stop party of grapes and lounging. It was a suffocating, endless loop of micromanagement. Let's look at how the Lord of the Two Lands started his day. He didn't get to sleep in. He was woken up exactly at dawn, not by an alarm, but by a chorus of priests chanting hymns to the sun. Because, as the living embodiment of Horus, if the pharaoh wasn't awake to greet the sun, the universe might just forget to exist. Or at least, that was the working theory. Once awake, the pharaoh didn't just throw on a robe. He was subjected to a morning routine that took hours. He was bathed in scented waters by high-ranking officials. And I mean high-ranking. In the royal court, the closer you were to the pharaoh's physical body, the more power you had. This led to some incredibly specific and deeply weird job titles. For example, during the Old Kingdom, one of the most prestigious positions you could hold in the Egyptian government was the chief of the scented oils, But even more coveted than that was a role that translates roughly to the shepherd of the royal anus. Yes, you heard that right. The Egyptians were medically obsessed with the digestive tract. They believed that all disease originated in the gut, usually from food decaying in the intestines. So a massive part of maintaining the health of the living god involved regular, scheduled enemas and digestive purges. And the person in charge of this delicate process was considered a VIP of the highest order. Because nothing says divine ruler of the cosmos quite like having a designated government minister for your bowel movements. After his medical rituals, the pharaoh was dressed in fine linen and covered in jewelry. He also had heavy black makeup called kohl applied around his eyes. We look at this today and think it was purely for the aesthetic. It was a dramatic look, sure, but its primary purpose was actually quite mundane. It reduced the glare of the desert sun, and the lead salts in the makeup helped repel the thick swarms of flies that hovered everywhere in ancient Egypt. So underneath the gold and the divinity, the pharaoh was essentially just a guy wearing heavy toxic eyeliner to keep bugs out of his tear ducts. Once he was dressed, the pharaoh had to perform rituals in the temple. This wasn't a quick morning prayer. This was a grueling process of making offerings, burning incense, and reciting incredibly long, incredibly specific incantations to ensure the Nile would flood and the crops would grow. If he fumbled a word, it was a bad omen. He had to do this multiple times a day. He was a prisoner of his own PR. And who did the pharaoh hang out with when he wasn't working? Well, mostly his family. And in ancient Egypt, the concept of family was, let's say, very compact. The pharaohs believed their bloodline was divine. The gods Osiris and Isis were brother and sister, and they were married. So to keep the divine blood pure, the royal family felt they had to follow suit. The result was a royal family tree that didn't so much branch out as it just curled inward on itself until it formed a tight, genetically disastrous wreath. Let's look at the most famous pharaoh of them all, King Tutankhamun. When Howard Carter found his tomb in the 1920s, the world was captivated by the sheer wealth, the solid gold death mask, the golden chariots. The image of the boy king was cemented in our minds as this beautiful, tragic, golden youth. But the reality of King Tut was distinctly less glamorous. We have his mummy. We've run the DNA tests. And the DNA tells a story of extreme compounding inbreeding. Tutankhamun's father was the controversial pharaoh Akhenaten. His mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters, so his parents were full siblings. Because of this, the golden boy was born with a myriad of health problems. He had a cleft palate. He had a severely deformed left foot, a clubfoot, which meant he walked on the side of his ankle. He suffered from Kohler disease, a painful condition where the bones in the foot slowly die from lack of blood flow. He also had multiple bouts of malaria. When you picture King Tut, don't picture a strapping young conqueror. Picture a frail, chronically ill teenager who couldn't stand up straight without help. In fact, his tomb was packed with over 100 walking sticks, many of them showing heavy signs of wear and tear. The Lord of the Two Lands, the living god, needed a cane just to hobble across his palace floor. And of course, following the family tradition, when Tutankhamun got married, he married his half-sister. Because why not double down on the genetic lottery? It's a stark, ironic contrast. The most famous symbol of ancient wealth and power was, in his daily life, a sickly kid in constant pain, trapped in a palace, marrying his sister, and letting priests micromanage his diet. But if you think the Egyptians were trapped by their rituals, let's float east. Let's cross the desert and settle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Welcome to ancient Mesopotamia. Welcome to the empires of Babylon and Assyria. If the Egyptian pharaohs were smothered by routine, the Mesopotamian kings were paralyzed by paranoia. These kings had titles that were genuinely terrifying. They called themselves the King of the Universe, the King of the Four Corners of the world. They lived in massive, sprawling palaces decorated with stone carvings of themselves hunting lions and crushing their enemies. They had huge, meticulously curled beards and carried themselves with absolute terrifying authority. But behind the thick palace walls, the king of the universe was usually terrified. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods were constantly sending them messages. These messages were woven into the fabric of the natural world. If a strange bird flew over the palace, it was a message. If a dog barked on the left side of the street instead of the right, it was a message. And most importantly, the stars and planets were giant, glowing warning signs. Because of this, the king employed an army of astrologers, diviners, and scholars. Their entire job was to observe the world, read the omens, and write reports to the king. We have thousands of these clay tablets. They are basically ancient anxiety-inducing text messages. A typical morning for the king of the universe involved sitting in his throne room and listening to his scholars read him a list of everything that was about to go wrong. My lord, an eclipse of the moon was observed in the month of Sivan. This means the king's enemies will rise. Or, my lord, a deformed sheep was born in the northern province. This means a plague is coming. The king couldn't just ignore this. He had to act. And acting usually meant performing elaborate, tedious rituals to ward off the bad luck. Sometimes, the omens were so bad that the king was advised not to leave his room for days. He would just sit there, in his massive palace, eating honey cakes and waiting for the bad juju to pass, completely hostage to a flock of birds that happened to fly in the wrong direction. But the absolute peak of Mesopotamian royal dysfunction was a ritual known as the Sharpu, or the substitute king ritual. Sometimes, the omens were dire. Specifically, if there was a total solar eclipse. A solar eclipse was the ultimate red flag. It meant that the gods were furious, and they were targeting the king directly. The king's life was in imminent danger. So what does the king of the universe do when the universe wants him dead? He finds a loophole. The royal scholars would go out into the city and find a random, usually lower-class person. A gardener, a farmer, maybe a prisoner. They would bring this very confused man into the palace. They would scrub him clean. They would dress him in the king's royal robes. They would put the king's crown on his head. They would even give him a queen to sit beside him. For about 100 days, this random gardener was officially the king. He sat on the throne. He was served the finest foods. People bowed to him. Meanwhile, the real king shaved his head, put on the ragged clothes of a peasant, and hid in a back room of the palace, going by a fake name. He referred to himself in letters as the farmer. The logic here is almost painfully literal. The gods are looking down from heaven. They see a guy in a crown sitting on a throne. The gods, being apparently very nearsighted, say, "Ah, there is the king. Let us direct our wrath at him." The bad omens hit the substitute, and the real king, hiding in the pantry, is safe. But of course, a ritual like this has a very dark punchline. When the 100 days were up, and the danger of the eclipse had passed, the real king wanted his throne back. But you can't just have a guy wandering around the city who used to be the king. It's bad for the brand. So the substitute king and his substitute queen were quietly retired. And by retired, I mean they were given a cup of something very toxic, and they were sent to the underworld. They were given a royal funeral naturally, because they had technically been the monarch. Imagine being that gardener. You are pulling weeds one day, and the next you are wearing a crown, eating roast lamb, and enjoying the absolute height of luxury, all while knowing, deep down, exactly how this vacation is going to end. And imagine the real king, the mighty conqueror, crouching in a closet for 3 months, terrified of a shadow passing over the sun. It's a perfect encapsulation of the ancient elite. Supreme power paired with supreme vulnerability. They built walls 50 feet thick, but they couldn't keep out the quiet, creeping dread that they were entirely at the mercy of the cosmos. So they hid behind rituals. They hid behind substitutes. They hid behind heavily guarded doors. But as history marches on, the empires get bigger. And when the empires get bigger, the dysfunction doesn't go away. It just gets a lot more expensive and a lot more public. Let's gently leave the desert paranoias behind. Let's float forward a few centuries toward the Mediterranean. Let us drift over to a place where the kings didn't just hide in palaces, they threw massive, violent public spectacles to prove how normal they were. Let's talk about Rome. Because if you want to talk about dysfunctional families, the Caesars are the absolute gold standard. So we are leaving this sun-baked mud brick and the paranoid astrologers of the ancient Middle East. We are drifting westward, across the Mediterranean Sea, until we reach the Italian peninsula. We are stepping onto the polished marble floors of ancient Rome. When you picture the Roman elite, specifically the emperors, the Caesars, you probably imagine a life of absolute, unadulterated luxury. You picture them reclining on plush couches, eating peeled grapes, watching gladiators, and casually deciding the fate of millions with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. You imagine absolute power, and they did have absolute power. But absolute power, as it turns out, is a logistical nightmare. Let's look at what a wealthy Roman patrician, or the emperor himself, actually did when he woke up. Because his day did not begin peacefully. It began with an institution known as the salutatio. If you were a man of importance in Rome, you did not get to enjoy a quiet morning coffee. The moment the sun rose, your front doors were unlocked, and a crowd of people would literally flood into your house. These were your clients in Roman society. Everyone was connected in a massive, exhausting web of favors and obligations. The wealthy patron provided legal protection, business opportunities, and sometimes just literal pocket change to his clients. In return, the clients provided the patron with social clout, votes, and an entourage. So every single morning, the emperor or the senator would have to put on his heavy, incredibly cumbersome woolen toga, which, by the way, was so difficult to put on that you needed a specialized slave just to drape it over your shoulder correctly, and he would go stand in his atrium. For hours, he would greet a line of hundreds of people. He had to remember their names, or at least pretend to, usually with the help of a slave whispering in his ear. He had to listen to their petty complaints. My neighbor stole my goat. My roof is leaking. Can you get my son a job in the army? He would hand out small baskets of food or coins, called the sportula, just to keep them happy. It was essentially a daily mandatory networking event in your own living room before breakfast. Imagine the sheer introverted dread of waking up every day, knowing there are 200 people standing in your foyer, expecting you to solve their problems. And no one embodied the tedious micromanagement of Roman power quite like the very first emperor, Augustus. Augustus is a fascinating case study in historical irony. He defeated all his rivals, ended the Republic, and became the sole ruler of the known world. But he was terrified of looking like a king. The Romans famously hated kings. So Augustus spent his entire day aggressively pretending to just be a normal, albeit very successful guy. He didn't live in a sprawling gold-plated palace. He lived in a relatively modest house on the Palatine Hill. He didn't wear fancy royal purple robes. He wore simple wool tunics that, he proudly told everyone, were hand-woven by his wife, Livia, and his daughter Julia. He was the most powerful man on earth, and his primary public relations strategy was aggressive, folksy modesty. His daily routine was aggressively boring. While he could have feasted on peacock tongues and imported oysters, Augustus preferred the diet of a peasant. He snacked on coarse bread, a bit of ordinary cheese, and maybe a fig. He was known to eat while riding in his litter, just grabbing a quick bite of dry bread between meetings. But behind this mask of a simple, hard-working public servant, Augustus was a stressed-out micromanager. He spent his days writing endless legislation, trying to fix the moral decay of Rome. He passed laws dictating exactly how much you could spend on a dinner party. He passed laws making adultery a state crime. He was essentially a helicopter parent to an entire empire. And like many helicopter parents, his own family was a complete disaster. He spent his days lecturing the Senate about family values, but his own daughter, Julia, was infamous for her late-night, highly scandalous parties in the Roman Forum. The stress of trying to control an empire while failing to control his own teenager eventually led Augustus to banish his only child to a tiny, barren island. Perhaps because of all this stress, Augustus was a terrible sleeper. He suffered from severe insomnia. He would wake up 3 or 4 times a night. And because he was the emperor, his insomnia became everyone else's problem. When he couldn't sleep, he would send for his readers or his storytellers. Imagine being a minor Roman scribe. It's 3 a.m. You are rudely awakened, dragged through the dark streets to the Palatine Hill, and ordered to sit by the emperor's bed and read dull philosophy or tell rambling stories until the ruler of the free world finally dozed off. Augustus literally invented the concept of the sleep podcast. He just used live humans to do it. When Augustus finally passed away, the throne went to his stepson, Tiberius. And if Augustus was a stressed-out micromanager, Tiberius was a deeply grumpy introvert who despised the daily grind of ruling. Tiberius hated the salutatio. He hated the Senate. He hated the endless games and gladiatorial matches that the emperors were expected to attend and pretend to enjoy. He was a brilliant military general who just wanted to read Greek poetry and be left alone. So in the middle of his reign, Tiberius did something unprecedented. He just left. He packed up his bags, left Rome, and moved to a villa on the island of Capri, off the coast of Naples. And he basically refused to come back. For the last 11 years of his life, the Roman Empire was run by a moody absentee landlord who communicated almost exclusively through passive-aggressive letters. The Senate would write to him, begging for his opinion on urgent state matters, and Tiberius would either ignore them completely or send back a cryptic, sarcastic response. He essentially left the empire unread. He spent his days walking along the sheer cliffs of Capri, avoiding people and consulting with his personal astrologer, a man named Thrasyllus. Tiberius was deeply paranoid, constantly terrified of assassination plots. So instead of dealing with the stress of the capital, he chose the isolation of an island, trading the noisy, crowded streets of Rome for the quiet, echoing dread of his own thoughts. Of course, leaving the center of power empty is a bad idea. It allowed ambitious, terrible people to run things in his absence. And when Tiberius finally died, the empire was handed over to his great-nephew, a young man named Gaius, better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula. Now history loves to focus on Caligula's legendary cruelty and his bizarre decrees. But if we look at his daily life, we find a much more mundane route to his madness: severe, chronic sleep deprivation. If Augustus had trouble sleeping, Caligula practically stopped sleeping altogether. The Roman historian Suetonius tells us that Caligula rarely slept more than 3 hours a night. And even those 3 hours were plagued by horrific night terrors. He claimed he was visited by the Phantom of the Sea, a terrifying hallucination that would jolt him awake in a cold sweat. Imagine his reality. You are 25 years old. You are the most powerful human being on the planet. Everyone agrees with everything you say, no matter how ridiculous it is. And you are functioning on a permanent, hallucinatory lack of sleep. His nights were spent wandering the massive, expanding palace complexes on the Palatine Hill. Picture it. Miles of cold marble corridors, completely empty, lit only by flickering oil lamps. Caligula would pace through these halls, exhausted but unable to rest, literally shouting at the sun, demanding that it rise so the day could begin. When you look at his strange decisions, like supposedly wanting to make his favorite horse a consul or declaring war on the sea, and ordering his soldiers to stab the water and collect seashells as plunder, it starts to look less like cartoonish villainy, and more like the erratic, desperate actions of a young man whose brain was slowly melting from lack of REM sleep. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was a deeply tired, highly caffeinated toddler who just happened to command several legions. Fortunately for Rome, Caligula's reign was short, and his assassination led to the sudden, very unexpected promotion of his uncle Claudius. Claudius is one of the most remarkable figures in Roman history. mostly because he survived. In a family that routinely poisoned, stabbed, and exiled each other, Claudius lived to his 50s simply because everyone thought he was an idiot. He had physical ailments, he limped. He stuttered severely. When he was angry or excited, he tended to drool. His own mother, Antonia, used to call him a monster of a man, not finished by nature, but only half done. She used him as the standard for stupidity. "He's as big a fool as my son Claudius," she would say. Because he was considered an embarrassment, he was kept out of the public eye. He wasn't given administrative duties. He wasn't allowed to command armies. So what did Claudius do all day for 50 years? He sat in the library. He became a scholar. He read obsessively. He wrote multi-volume histories of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians. He even tried to invent 3 new letters to add to the Latin alphabet, because he felt the current one was phonetically incomplete. He was, essentially, a massive nerd, perfectly happy to spend his days arguing with his tutors about obscure historical trivia. Then, Caligula is assassinated. The Praetorian Guard is ransacking the palace. They find Claudius hiding behind a curtain, terrified. They pull him out, and because they need an emperor to justify their own existence, they declare the stuttering middle-aged historian the ruler of the Roman world. Suddenly, Claudius's quiet days in the library are over. Now he has to work. And his daily routine became a bizarre mix of extreme diligence and complete absent-mindedness. He took his role as supreme judge very seriously. Every day, he would go down to the Roman Forum and preside over legal cases. But the problem was, Claudius loved his comfort, and he didn't have the stamina of Augustus. The historical records are full of stories of Claudius simply falling asleep on the bench during important trials. The lawyers would be in the middle of a passionate, hours-long speech about property rights or treason, and they would hear a gentle snoring coming from the emperor's chair. They would actually have to raise their voices, or sometimes have a clerk gently shake the emperor to wake him up so he could render a verdict. He was also easily distracted, especially by food. Suetonius tells a story of Claudius judging a case in the Forum of Augustus. Right next door was the Temple of Mars, where the priests were preparing a massive feast. Claudius smelled the roasting meat, abruptly stood up in the middle of the trial, left the courtroom, walked over to the temple, and just sat down with the priests to eat lunch. He was the emperor. Who was going to stop him? So you have this beautiful, ironic contrast. The mighty Caesars, the men who claimed descent from the gods, whose statues were worshipped across 3 continents. In reality, they were a stressed-out insomniac trying to micromanage his daughter's wardrobe, a grumpy hermit hiding on an island, a sleep-deprived young man yelling at the moon, and an elderly historian who just wanted to take a nap and eat a hot meal. It proves that while absolute power might corrupt absolutely, it also mostly just makes you very, very tired. The sheer bureaucratic weight of running the ancient world was enough to break anyone's daily routine. But eventually, Rome fell, the marble columns toppled. The central authority collapsed, and humanity decided to try a different approach. Instead of one massive centralized empire, we splintered into thousands of tiny, squabbling fiefdoms. Let's gently leave the warm, sun-drenched marble of the Mediterranean. We are going to drift north. The air is getting cooler. The skies are getting grayer. We are entering a time of thick wool, drafty halls, and incredibly questionable medical advice. Let's float into the Middle Ages and see what the kings and queens of Europe did when the grandeur of Rome was replaced by the damp, gloomy, and delightfully miserable reality of the medieval castle. Let's leave the marble and the Mediterranean sun behind. The Roman Empire has collapsed, the aqueducts are drying up, and we are floating north. The air is getting decidedly chillier. The sky has turned a permanent, bruised shade of gray. We are drifting into the Middle Ages. When you think of a medieval king or queen, thanks to centuries of fairy tales and fantasy novels, you probably picture something quite romantic. You imagine towering stone castles with pennants flapping in the wind, Roaring fireplaces, knights in shining armor, and elegant ladies in velvet gowns. You imagine a life of robust, chivalric luxury. But the reality of living in a medieval castle was less happily ever after, and more chronically damp and smelling faintly of wet dog. Let's look at how a medieval monarch actually spent their day. And right away, we have to discard the concept of privacy. If you were a king in the 12th or 13th century, you were never, ever alone. From the moment you were born to the moment you died, you were surrounded by a swarm of courtiers, guards, servants, and minor nobles, who were all desperately trying to climb the social ladder by just standing as close to you as possible. The king's day began in the royal bedchamber. But this wasn't a private sanctuary. The king's bed was essentially a small tent inside a massive, drafty room. It had heavy velvet curtains pulled tight on all sides, not for aesthetic reasons, but simply to prevent the king from freezing to death in his sleep. Castles were essentially just large stone refrigerators. Even with a fire roaring in the hearth, the heat dissipated instantly into the high ceilings. When the king woke up, the curtains were pulled back and he would find several people already in the room. Some of them had literally slept on the floor at the foot of his bed, just to be the first ones to greet him. Getting dressed was a spectator sport. It was a highly choreographed routine where different nobles had the specific inherited right to hand the king his shirt or tie his shoes. And then there was the matter of morning hygiene, or rather, the distinct lack of it. Indoor plumbing had died with the Romans. If the king needed to use the restroom, he went to the garderobe. This was a tiny freezing closet built into the outer wall of the castle, featuring a stone bench with a hole in it. Anything dropped down that hole simply fell 50 or 60 feet down the side of the castle wall into a moat or a cesspit. In the dead of winter, the updraft coming up through that hole was legendary. It was not a place you lingered with a scroll. Before the king even had breakfast, he had a mandatory meeting with his physician. And medieval medicine was, to put it mildly, deeply unhelpful. It was based entirely on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were sick, it just meant your humors were out of balance. To check the royal balance, the physician needed to examine the king's morning urine. They took this very seriously. The doctor would hold a glass flask of it up to the light. He would study the color. He would swirl it around to check the viscosity. He would smell it. And yes, if he was a highly paid, dedicated professional, he would taste it. Because nothing says divine right to rule, quite like having an Oxford-educated scholar sip your bodily fluids before breakfast to make sure you haven't eaten too many eels. If the urine was too cloudy or too sweet, the doctor would immediately prescribe a treatment to rebalance the humors. Usually, this meant bloodletting. They would just open a vein and drain a pint or two of blood out of the already cold, tired monarch. Or, if they were feeling less invasive, they would apply leeches. This was considered cutting-edge preventative care. Once he was drained of a little blood and cleared by the doctor, the king could finally eat. But medieval royal diets were a nutritional nightmare. Vegetables were considered peasant food. Things that grew in the dirt, like carrots, onions, or turnips, were beneath the dignity of a noble stomach. The elite diet consisted almost entirely of meat, bread, and wine. They ate roasted swans, peacocks, whole pigs, and elaborate meat pies. Because water was generally unsafe to drink, everyone, including children, drank weak ale or watered-down wine all day long. The result of this low-fiber, high-purine, zero-vitamin C diet was entirely predictable. The medieval elite suffered heavily from scurvy, making their gums bleed and their teeth fall out, and they were plagued by agonizing bouts of gout. They were incredibly wealthy, but they were essentially slowly poisoning themselves at every meal. After breakfast, the king actually had to do some work. He would sit in the great hall and hold court. But a medieval court wasn't a neat, orderly bureaucracy like we saw in Rome. It was loud, chaotic, and smelled terrible. The floors of the castle were covered in rushes, basically dried reeds and herbs meant to insulate the stone and smell nice. but they only changed the top layer. So, over the course of a few months, the bottom layers of these rushes became a compacted, rotting mat of dropped food, spilled ale, dog droppings, and general grime. This brings us to one of the most exhausting, tedious aspects of a medieval monarch's life, the itinerant court. A medieval king did not just live in one capital city. He moved, constantly. The court was basically a massive, heavily armed traveling circus of about 500 people. They would travel from castle to castle, abbey to abbey, staying at each location for a few weeks or maybe a month. Why did they move? Partly to show the flag and project power across the realm. But the main reason was far more practical. A court of 500 nobles, servants, horses, and hunting dogs consumes a massive amount of resources. If they stayed in one castle for too long, they would literally eat the surrounding countryside bare. They would empty the granaries, drink all the wine, and crucially, they would fill up the castle's cesspits until the smell became completely intolerable. So when the food ran out and the plumbing backed up, the king would declare it was time to move. This was a logistical nightmare. They didn't just pack some clothes, they packed everything. Because medieval castles were mostly just empty stone shells, the royal household had to bring their own furniture. They packed the tapestries that insulated the walls. They packed the king's bed. They packed the silver plates, the heavy wooden chairs, the chests of clothing, and the endless barrels of wine. They loaded it all onto hundreds of wooden carts, pulled by oxen, and set off down deeply rutted, muddy dirt roads at a blistering pace of maybe 10 miles a day. Imagine doing this every few weeks for your entire life. Just endlessly packing up your living room, riding through the freezing rain, arriving at a cold, empty stone box, hanging your tapestries, eating all the local pigs, and then packing it all up again. It was a life of absolute power, characterized almost entirely by the feeling of being cold, mildly hungover, and stuck in traffic behind an ox cart. And the stress of this life, of holding together a fractured kingdom while dealing with plotting barons, foreign wars, and terrible medicine, frequently broke these rulers. Let's gently focus on one specific, tragic example of medieval royal dysfunction. Let's look at King Charles VI of France, who ruled in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Charles actually started out great. He was handsome, athletic, and successful, earning the nickname Charles the Beloved. But the sheer pressure of ruling during the 100 Years' War eventually caused his mind to simply snap. In 1392, Charles was leading his army through a forest on a hot August day. A crazed beggar suddenly ran out from the trees, grabbed the king's horse, and yelled that the king was betrayed. Charles, already stressed and likely suffering from a fever, completely lost his grip on reality. He drew his sword and attacked his own men, killing several of his own knights before they could wrestle him to the ground and tie him up. When he woke up from his coma days later, he was a different man. For the rest of his long life, Charles suffered from severe bouts of mental illness that would last for months at a time. And the specific nature of his delusions perfectly highlights the fragile reality of being a monarch. During his episodes, Charles would forget he was the king. He would forget he had a wife and children. He would run wildly through the halls of his Parisian palaces, claiming his name was George and that his royal coat of arms was a lie. The servants literally had to board up the doors to keep the King of France from escaping into the streets. But his most famous delusion, and one that required a bizarre adjustment to his daily routine, was the glass delusion. Charles became absolutely convinced that his body was made entirely of glass. He believed that if anyone bumped into him, or if he fell, he would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Imagine the sheer logistical panic this caused in the royal household. You have a king who needs to be dressed, fed, and moved from castle to castle, but who screams in terror if anyone gets within 5 feet of him, because he thinks they will break him. To cope with this, Charles had iron rods sewn into the heavy wool of his clothes. He thought these metal ribs would protect his fragile glass body from shattering. He refused to travel by carriage, fearing the bumps in the road would crack his legs. He would just sit in a chair in the corner of his room, wrapped in thick blankets, absolutely rigid, terrified to move a muscle, while his country slowly tore itself apart in a brutal civil war. It is a deeply sad, ironic contrast. The man who was supposedly chosen by God to be the unbreakable shield of France spent his days sitting in a dark room, wearing iron pajamas, terrified that a strong breeze would shatter him like a wine goblet. And because he was the king, nobody could just replace him. They had to work around him. The royal court still functioned. Laws were still passed. Wars were still fought. All while the man technically in charge was hiding under a blanket, crying about his glass fingers. The dysfunction was baked into the system. If the king was broken, the country just had to pretend he wasn't and carry on packing the ox carts. This was the rhythm of the Middle Ages, a slow grinding cycle of moving, feasting, freezing, and bleeding, overseen by people whose family trees were starting to look a little too streamlined, and whose grip on reality was often slipping away. But as the centuries dragged on, the castles slowly started to become obsolete. Gunpowder arrived, meaning high stone walls could just be blasted apart. The elite realized they didn't need to live in drafty fortresses anymore. They could build palaces. Big, sweeping, beautiful palaces with massive windows and manicured gardens. We are going to float forward in time. We are heading into the Renaissance and the early modern period. The clothes are going to get much more elaborate. The plumbing is going to marginally improve. But the people, well, the people are going to get so much stranger. Let's drift into the era of the Habsburgs, where we will discover exactly what happens when a family decides that the only people good enough to marry them are themselves. So we are floating out of the dark, damp, drafty halls of the Middle Ages. We are leaving the iron pajamas and the bad plumbing behind. We are drifting into the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries. This is an era of discovery, of global empires, of massive galleons carrying literal tons of silver across the oceans. It's the Renaissance. Art is flourishing. Science is waking up. Humanity is expanding its horizons. And yet, at the exact same time humanity is expanding outward, the most powerful family in the world is aggressively contracting inward. Welcome to the era of the Habsburgs. If the Egyptian pharaohs had a family wreath, the Habsburgs had a family tumbleweed. They are the undisputed, reigning champions of historical inbreeding. They were originally a minor noble family from Switzerland who stumbled upon the ultimate geopolitical cheat code. Their family motto was literally, "Let others wage war." You, happy Austria, marry, and marry they did. They married into the royal families of Burgundy, Bohemia, Hungary, and Spain. By the 1500s, they controlled about half of the known world. But here is the problem with marrying to acquire massive amounts of land and wealth. Eventually, you run out of people who are equal to you. And more importantly, if you marry someone from outside the family, you risk splitting up the inheritance. The Habsburgs looked at their massive, global empire stretching from the Philippines to the Americas to Austria to Spain, and decided they were absolutely not sharing it with strangers. So they just started marrying each other. Over and over and over again. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. For almost 200 years, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family practically refused to introduce any new DNA into their gene pool. And the result was an aesthetic and medical disaster that they proudly displayed to the entire world. Let us talk about the most famous physical consequence of this genetic echo chamber, the Habsburg jaw. Scientifically, it's called mandibular prognathism. Essentially, the lower jaw grows significantly faster and larger than the upper jaw. It juts out, creating a severe underbite. But it wasn't just the jaw. They also suffered from maxillary deficiency, meaning the middle of their face, the cheekbones, and the nose was sunken in. And on top of that, they often had a thickened, drooping lower lip. Imagine being one of the greatest portrait painters of the Renaissance. Say you are Titian or Diego Velázquez. You are summoned to the royal court. You are paid an absolute fortune to paint the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, or the King of Spain. And the man who sits down in front of you looks like a half-baked potato with an architectural overhang for a chin. You can't just paint what you see, because he might have you executed. But you also can't completely lie, because everyone knows what he looks like. So you get these deeply fascinating, highly diplomatic paintings where the artist has clearly used every trick of lighting and shadow to try and minimize a jawline that could comfortably function as a shovel. The jaw wasn't just ugly. It was deeply impractical. Because their top and bottom teeth didn't meet, many of the Habsburg monarchs couldn't actually chew their food. They had to swallow everything whole, which led to lifelong, agonizing digestive issues. Because their lips didn't close properly, they had a tendency to drool. And their tongues were often unusually large, meaning the most powerful men in the world, men who dictated the fate of millions, frequently spoke with a severe, wet lisp. Let us look at the daily life of the man who ruled the Spanish Empire at its absolute peak. King Philip II. Philip was the master of the world. Silver from the Americas flowed directly into his coffers. His armies were feared everywhere. But Philip did not spend his days feasting or hunting or throwing lavish parties. He spent his days doing paperwork. Philip II was history's most powerful, most exhausted middle manager. He built a massive, austere palace outside of Madrid called the El Escorial. It wasn't designed to be beautiful or fun. It was designed to be a monastery, a tomb, and an office building. It was essentially a giant gray filing cabinet made of stone. Philip's daily routine was relentlessly boring. He dressed entirely in black. Always black. It was a flex, actually, because the deep black dye from the Americas was incredibly expensive, but it also perfectly matched his completely joyless personality. He would wake up early, attend mass, and then go into a small, sparsely furnished room. And he would sit at his desk for up to 14 hours a day. He insisted on micromanaging his entire global empire. If a minor local official in a tiny town in Peru needed to repair a bridge, Philip wanted to read the proposal. He received mountains of documents every day, carried into his office in massive leather satchels, and he read them all. We still have these documents today, and they are covered in Philip's tiny, cramped handwriting. He would write notes in the margins. He would correct the spelling of his ambassadors. He would complain about the grammar used by his generals. He was the CEO of a global superpower, and he spent his afternoons acting as a glorified copy editor. Because he swallowed his food whole, he had terrible stomach aches. And because his diet consisted mostly of rich meats, he suffered from crippling gout. Gout is a type of arthritis caused by a buildup of uric acid, usually in the big toe, and it is supposedly one of the most painful conditions a human can experience. A light breeze touching the toe can cause excruciating agony. So picture the daily reality of the absolute ruler of the Spanish Empire. He is sitting in a dark, cold, quiet room in the middle of a barren plateau. He is wearing plain black clothes. He is drooling slightly onto a report about a tax dispute in Naples. He is reading by the flickering light of a candle, his eyes red and strained. And his foot is resting on a velvet pillow, throbbing with a pain so intense that, if a servant walks too heavily across the floorboards, the King of Spain might just burst into tears. He was drowning in paper. He was paralyzed by indecision, terrified of making a mistake, and completely isolated from the real world. He built a paper empire, and he trapped himself inside it. But Philip II was highly functional compared to what was coming, because the family just kept marrying each other. Philip too married his niece, Anna of Austria. She was the mother of his heir, and her family tree was just as tangled as his. Let's fast forward a few generations. The endless loop of uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages is compounding. The genetic errors are stacking up, layer upon layer. And finally, the Spanish Habsburg line produces its tragic, inevitable finale. King Charles II, Carlos II, known to history as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched. Carlos is the endpoint of the family wreath. Modern geneticists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient. Now, if a brother and sister have a child, that child has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Carlos II's coefficient was 0.254. Because his ancestors had been inbreeding for so long, his parents, who were an uncle and a niece, actually shared more identical DNA than a standard brother and sister would. When Carlos was born, the ambassadors at the Spanish court didn't send home letters celebrating a healthy heir. They sent home letters saying, essentially, this poor child is not going to make it. But he did make it, mostly because the entire machinery of the Spanish Empire was dedicated to keeping him alive. His daily life was a bizarre, profoundly sad mixture of absolute reverence and complete medical ignorance. Because of his genetics, Carlos was physically and mentally disabled. He didn't learn to walk until he was 8 years old. When he did walk, it was a precarious shuffling stumble. He didn't learn to speak until he was 10, and even then, because his Habsburg jaw was so extreme, his words were almost completely incomprehensible. His tongue was so large he could barely fit it in his mouth. So what did the King of Spain do all day? Well, mostly, he was just moved around. The court treated him like a fragile holy relic. He wasn't allowed to do anything that might stress him. He wasn't educated. They didn't bother trying to teach him to read or write beyond signing his own name, because they figured it would just upset him. He spent his days in the dark, heavy, velvet-draped rooms of the Royal Alcazar in Madrid. He liked to play with games. He liked watching the court dwarfs, who were kept around purely for his entertainment. He would spend hours just sitting by a window, staring blankly out at the rain. He was the absolute monarch of millions of people, but his emotional and intellectual age was stuck in early childhood. And his health was a constant, terrifying crisis for the court. He suffered from rickets. He had epilepsy, enduring violent seizures. He had terrible intestinal problems because, like his ancestors, he couldn't chew his food. The doctors of the 17th century had absolutely no concept of genetics. They couldn't understand why the most powerful, divinely appointed family on earth was producing children who kept dying, or who survived only as frail, suffering shells. So they fell back on the only explanation that made sense to them: witchcraft. They genuinely believed that Carlos was bewitched. They thought a demon had been placed inside him. So the daily medical routine of the King of Spain didn't involve physical therapy or specialized diets. It involved exorcisms. Priests were constantly hovering around him. They would chant prayers, splash him with holy water, and force him to drink bizarre, foul-tasting potions meant to drive out the evil spirits. When things got really bad, they would bring the mummified remains of saints into his bedroom and lay them on his bed, hoping the holy aura would cure his indigestion. And they refused to wash him. There was a prevailing medical theory at the time that water opened the pores and let diseases and demons into the body. So Carlos, who already suffered from a myriad of ailments, was also kept aggressively unwashed for months at a time. The smell in the royal bedchamber must have been an absolute wall of aristocratic funk, masked only by heavy clouds of frankincense. He was married twice, of course. The empire needed an heir. His first wife, a French princess, reportedly took one look at her new husband, who was shuffling toward her, drooling, completely unwashed and surrounded by chanting priests, and practically had a breakdown. Surprisingly, Carlos was apparently quite fond of her, in his own childlike way. But the marriages were entirely fruitless. His genetic code was so degraded, he was completely infertile. Carlos, too, lived to the age of 38, which was frankly a miracle of stubborn biology. He spent his entire life in pain, confused, heavily manipulated by the factions at his court, and completely unaware of the massive geopolitical disaster his very existence represented. When he finally died in 1700, the autopsy report was a horrifying read. The physician claimed his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs corroded. his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. Now, we have to take that 18th century medical description with a grain of salt, but it perfectly captures the tragic, decaying essence of the end of the Spanish Habsburgs. They had tried to hoard the world, and in doing so, they had simply destroyed themselves from the inside out. They spent their days drowning in paperwork and hiding behind tapestries, prisoners of their own exclusive bloodline. But dysfunction doesn't die, it just changes its address. As the Spanish Empire began its slow, inevitable decline, another power was rising right next door. A power that looked at the gloomy, black-clad, silent halls of the Spanish court and decided to go in the exact opposite direction. Let's float away from Madrid. Let's drift north, over the Pyrenees Mountains, and into France. Let's step into a world of blinding gold, mirrored halls, and a daily routine so rigidly, bizarrely public that it essentially turned the king into a human clock. So we are floating out of the dark, gloomy, and deeply confused halls of the Spanish Habsburgs. We are leaving the iron pajamas and the exorcisms behind. We are drifting north, over the Pyrenees Mountains, into a world that is visually entirely different. We are stepping into a world of blinding gold, of endless mirrors, of silk and satin and manicured gardens. We are entering the court of King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. If the Spanish court was a dark, silent tomb where the monarch hid from the world, the French court at Versailles was the exact opposite. It was a massive, glittering, incredibly loud fishbowl. And the king was the biggest, most spectacular fish, constantly on display. Louis XIV believed in the absolute, divine right of kings. He believed that he was not just the ruler of France, but the living, breathing heart of the nation. He famously or apocryphally, but it fits his vibe perfectly, said, "I am the state." And because he was the state, his daily life was not his own. His daily life was a meticulously choreographed public performance. He took the concept of the royal court and weaponized it. Before Louis, French nobles were dangerous. They had their own castles, their own armies, and a nasty habit of starting civil wars whenever they felt ignored. Louis decided that the best way to control them was to build a palace so magnificent and a social hierarchy so ridiculously complex that the nobles would spend all their time fighting each other over minor social privileges instead of fighting him over real power. He built Versailles. It was originally just a modest hunting lodge surrounded by a mosquito-infested swamp. But Louis poured the wealth of France into draining the swamp and building a palace that could house thousands of people. He then essentially told all the important nobles in France, "If you want any power, any money, or any favor from me, you have to live here, with me, under my roof." And once he had them trapped in his beautiful gilded cage, he subjected them to a daily routine that was so rigid, so relentlessly scheduled, that the philosopher Saint Simon later wrote, "You could look at your watch, see what time it was, and know exactly what the king was doing, down to the minute." Let's look at the morning routine. The Sun King did not just wake up. His waking was an astronomical event known as the lever, or the rising. It began at 7:30 a.m. A valet who had spent the night sleeping on a small cot at the foot of the king's bed would gently wake him. But the king didn't just get up and go to the bathroom. He had to wait, because getting out of bed was a highly structured, multi-stage spectator sport. First came the entrée familière. The king's doctors, his childhood friends, and his closest family members were allowed into the room. They would ask him how he slept. The doctors would perform a quick, humiliating public check of his physical well-being. They would wipe him down with a towel soaked in alcohol, because, as we will discuss shortly, bathing with water was considered extremely dangerous. Then came the petty lever, the short rising. The doors were opened a little wider, and a select group of high-ranking nobles, maybe a dozen or so men, were allowed in. These men had the supreme honor of watching the king put on his socks, his breeches, and his shoes. But the main event was the grand lever. At 8:15 a.m., the doors were thrown wide open, and up to 100 courtiers flooded into the bedroom. This was the moment the king actually put on his shirt. Now you might think putting on a shirt takes about 5 seconds. But at Versailles, it was a ceremony that could take a quarter of an hour. The king's shirt had to be handed to him. But it couldn't just be grabbed by anyone. The right to hand the king his shirt was the most coveted honor in France. If a minor prince was in the room, he got to hand the shirt to the king. But if a higher-ranking duke suddenly walked in, the prince had to hand the shirt to the duke, who would then hand it to the king. And if the king's brother walked in at the last second, the duke had to hand it to the brother. There are historical accounts of the King of France standing in the middle of this freezing, drafty bedroom, completely naked from the waist up, shivering, while 2 grown men in powdered wigs argued over who had the genetic right to hand him a piece of linen. It is the ultimate ironic contrast. The absolute monarch, the man whose word was law, couldn't even put his own clothes on without navigating a bureaucratic nightmare of aristocratic egos. He was a prisoner of his own vanity project. And while all this was happening, the king was also conducting state business. He would give quick orders, nod to petitioners, or pointedly ignore people he was mad at. At Versailles, simply being looked at by the king was a form of currency. If Louis glanced at you during the grand lever, your social stock skyrocketed. If he looked right through you, your career was basically over. Once he was dressed, the king would leave his bedroom and head to chapel. He walked down the Hall of Mirrors, a massive, stunning corridor lined with expensive glass. Hundreds of courtiers would line the hallway, bowing deeply as he passed, desperate just to catch his eye. But as they bowed in their beautiful silk coats and their heavy velvet dresses, they were ignoring a deeply unpleasant reality. Versailles was visually breathtaking, but olfactorily, it was an absolute nightmare. You see, Versailles housed about 5,000 to 10,000 people on any given day, but it had almost no toilets. The concept of a bathroom, as we know it, did not exist. For the king and the highest nobility, there was the chaise percée, the pierced chair. It was a velvet-covered wooden box with a hole in the seat and a chamber pot underneath. The king actually held meetings while sitting on his chaise percée. It was called the brevet de fer. Being invited into the king's private rooms to talk to him while he was doing his morning business was considered a mark of extreme intimacy and favor. Because why not combine absolute geopolitical power with absolute loss of basic human dignity? But for the thousands of minor nobles, servants, and visitors wandering the halls, there were no such luxuries. If a duke needed to relieve himself while waiting for the king, he didn't have many options. So he would simply step behind a heavy velvet curtain in a hallway, or go to the corner of a staircase, and do his business right there on the polished oak floors. Historical accounts from visitors to Versailles are filled with complaints about the overwhelming stench. The beautiful manicured gardens were treated as an open-air latrine. The corridors smelled of stale urine and unwashed bodies. Because remember, the medical consensus of the 17th century was still terrified of water. They believed that hot water opened the pores and allowed the plague to enter the body. Louis XIV famously only took a handful of full baths in his entire life, and usually only because his doctors forced him to, for a specific medical condition. Instead of washing, the French court relied on linen and perfume. They believed that changing your linen shirt multiple times a day would somehow draw the dirt and sweat out of your body. And to cover the smell of thousands of unwashed aristocrats living in a giant, poorly ventilated stone building, they used staggering amounts of heavy, musky perfumes. Louis himself was obsessed with scent. He had his own personal perfumer who created a custom scent for him every day. But eventually, the king developed terrible migraines, and by the end of his life, he couldn't stand the smell of any perfume at all. He decreed that no one could wear perfume in his presence, which meant that the court of Versailles in its final decades was just a raw, unmitigated wall of aristocratic body odor. After his morning meetings and a massive, heavy lunch, the king would spend his afternoon outdoors. He loved to hunt, and he loved to walk in his gardens. But even a simple walk was an exhausting public ordeal. If the king decided to walk in the gardens, a swarm of courtiers had to follow him, and the etiquette was brutal. Men had to carry their wide-brimmed hats under their arms, no matter how hot the sun was. Women had to walk in their incredibly heavy, wide dresses, corseted so tightly they could barely breathe, over miles of gravel paths. If it rained, you just got wet. You couldn't run for cover unless the king ran for cover. And Louis XIV, who fancied himself a robust, athletic god, almost never ran for cover. Then came the evening, and the most bizarre public spectacle of all, the grand couvert. This was the king's dinner. He usually ate alone at a table facing the room. And the room was packed. Anyone who was decently dressed, and I mean anyone, even a commoner who rented a sword and a nice hat for the evening, could walk into the palace and watch the King of France eat his dinner. They stood behind a velvet rope and just watched him chew. It was like going to the zoo, but the main attraction was an absolute monarch eating a roasted pheasant. And Louis was an eating machine. His stomach was reportedly twice the size of a normal human's. A typical dinner for the Sun King consisted of 4 plates of different soups, a whole pheasant, a partridge, a massive plate of salad, 2 slices of ham, mutton with garlic and gravy, a plate of pastries, and then fruit and hard-boiled eggs for dessert. He ate all of this with his fingers, because forks were still considered somewhat suspicious and overly Italian by the older French nobility. But despite the massive quantity of food, the dining experience was actually terrible. The kitchens at Versailles were located a huge distance from the king's apartments. By the time a dish was cooked, plated, and carried up the stairs, down the endless echoing corridors, and past multiple security checkpoints where it had to be tasted for poison, it was cold. The most powerful man in Europe, surrounded by unimaginable luxury, ate lukewarm, slightly congealed gravy every single night, while hundreds of strangers stared at him. And this massive, rich diet took a horrifying toll on his body. Just like the medieval kings, Louis suffered terribly from gout. But his most famous medical disaster involved his teeth. Louis had a raging sweet tooth. He loved candied fruits and sugar. By the time he was in his 40s, most of his teeth were rotting. His primary physician, a man named Daquin, decided that the only way to save the king's health was to remove all his top teeth. Remember, there was no anesthesia. The king was strapped to a chair, and the doctor literally ripped his teeth out of his skull. But it gets worse. During the extraction, the doctor was a bit too aggressive, and he accidentally tore out a large chunk of the king's upper palate. He created a hole connecting the roof of the king's mouth directly to his nasal cavity. To sterilize the wound, the doctor took a red-hot iron rod and cauterized the hole in the roof of the king's mouth. Again, with absolutely zero pain medication. The hole never properly healed. For the rest of his long, incredibly public life, whenever the Sun King drank a glass of wine or ate a spoonful of soup, there was a very real chance that the liquid would travel up through the hole in his palate and simply run out of his nose. Imagine the sheer, agonizing embarrassment. You are the Sun King. You are the divine embodiment of France. You are sitting at the Grand Couvert. 500 people are watching your every move in dead silence. You take a sip of Burgundy wine, and it dribbles out of your left nostril. Of course, nobody was allowed to mention it. Etiquette dictated that you pretend you didn't see the King of France leaking soup onto his silk cravat. Because if you pointed it out, you would be banished from Versailles, and your social life would be over. The courtiers just smiled, bowed, and quietly shifted their weight as their feet ached from standing for 4 hours straight. The day ended exactly as it began, but in reverse. The couture, or the going to bed. The courtiers crowded back into the king's bedroom. They watched him take off his clothes. They argued over who got to hold the heavy silver candlestick while he said his nightly prayers. They watched him climb into his massive curtained bed. And then, finally, the doors were closed, the velvet curtains were drawn, and the Sun King was allowed, for a few brief hours, to simply exist in the dark, alone with his thoughts, his gout, and the lingering smell of unwashed nobility. It was a life of absolute, crushing superficiality. The people of Versailles were trapped in a glittering, foul-smelling theater, playing parts they couldn't escape, commanded by a director whose own body was slowly falling apart under the weight of his own vanity. But as Louis XIV grew older, the gold started to tarnish. And across the English Channel, another royal family was busy proving that you don't need a massive mirrored palace to be deeply, profoundly dysfunctional. You just need a stubborn personality, a total lack of social awareness, and a really, really intense hatred for your own children. Let's drift across the gray, choppy waters of the Channel. Let's leave the perfumed stench of Versailles and arrive in the damp, foggy, remarkably grumpy court of Georgian England. Let's talk about the Hanoverians and the time the King of England decided he hated his son so much, he literally kidnapped his own grandson. So we are crossing the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel. We are leaving the overwhelming, perfumed stench of Versailles and arriving in the damp, foggy, and remarkably grumpy court of Georgian England. We are entering the era of the Hanoverians. And if you thought the Habsburgs had genetic issues, or the French had boundary issues, the Hanoverians had something much simpler. They just really, really hated their own children. It was practically a family tradition, a genetic curse of pure, unadulterated pettiness. For 4 generations, every single king of England absolutely despised his eldest son. The Hanoverian family dynamic makes a modern, tense holiday dinner look like a relaxing yoga retreat. Let's start with George I. He was a German prince who was essentially imported to Britain in 1714 because Parliament needed a Protestant king, and he was the closest eligible relative, even though he barely spoke English. George I was not a warm man. Before he even got to England, he had already locked his wife, Sophia Dorothea, in a German castle because she had an affair. He kept her locked in that castle for 32 years. She died there, never seeing her children again. So George I arrives in London as a grumpy, middle-aged bachelor who misses his German food and hates his new subjects. But the person he hated most of all was his son, the future George II. The two of them lived in St. James's Palace, and the atmosphere was toxic. The king refused to give his son any real power or responsibility. So what did the Prince of Wales do all day? He sulked. He threw alternate parties to try and draw the cool nobles away from his dad's boring parties. But the tension finally boiled over in 1717, during the christening. The Prince of Wales had just had a new baby, and he wanted his friend to be the godfather. The king, just to be difficult, said no, and assigned the Duke of Newcastle to be the godfather instead. During the actual church ceremony, right after the baby was baptized, the Prince of Wales walked up to the Duke of Newcastle. In his heavy, angry German accent, he whispered, "You are a rascal. I shall find you." He meant, "I shall fight you," as in, a duel. But the Duke of Newcastle thought the prince said, "I shall find you," as in, a murder threat. The Duke panicked and ran to the king. George I, absolutely thrilled to finally have an excuse, placed his own son under house arrest. A few days later, the king officially banished the Prince and Princess of Wales from the royal palace. But and here is the deeply cruel, petty twist: he kept their children. He decreed that the grandchildren belonged to the crown. The prince and princess had to pack their bags and leave their babies behind. They set up a rival court across town at Leicester House. For years, the King of England and the heir to the throne communicated only through incredibly passive-aggressive letters and by actively trying to ruin each other's political careers. It was a miserable, suffocating way to live. Eventually, George I died, probably of a stroke while riding in his carriage, and his son became George II. You might think that having suffered through such a terrible relationship with his father, George II would try to break the cycle. You would be wrong. George II took the family curse and cranked the volume all the way up. He had a son named Frederick, and George II and his wife, Queen Caroline, hated Frederick with a passion that is honestly hard to comprehend. Queen Caroline famously told an ambassador, "My dear firstborn is the greatest ass, and the greatest liar, and the greatest canaille, and the greatest beast in the whole world, and I heartily wish he was out of it." That is a direct quote from a mother about her son. The daily life of the royal family was a masterclass in awkwardness. They had to attend public events together. They had to sit in the royal box at the theater. And they would just aggressively ignore each other. If Frederick walked into a room, his mother would literally turn her chair around to face the wall. But the peak of this dysfunctional, miserable routine happened in 1737. Frederick's wife, Princess Augusta, went into labor. Now, the king and queen insisted that the baby had to be born at Hampton Court Palace, where they were staying, so they could verify the child was legitimate. Frederick, who had spent his entire life being bullied by his parents, decided he would rather die than let his baby be born under his father's roof. In the middle of the night, while Princess Augusta was having agonizing contractions and her water had already broken, Frederick forced her out of bed. He dragged her down the stairs in the dark. He shoved his sobbing, laboring wife into a carriage, and he ordered the driver to race the 12 miles from Hampton Court to St. James's Palace in London over terrible, bumpy, unpaved 18th century roads. Imagine that carriage ride. It is pitch black. The carriage is bouncing violently. The princess is screaming in pain, actively giving birth. The prince is sitting there, utterly terrified but fueled entirely by spite, just hoping they can make it to London before the baby crowns. They barely made it. They rushed into St. James's Palace, which wasn't even prepared for them, and they had to put the princess in a bed between two tablecloths because they couldn't find any clean sheets. She gave birth to a healthy girl. When Queen Caroline found out what Frederick had done, she raced to London, burst into the bedroom, looked at the baby, and then famously declared that she hoped she would never see her son again. And she got her wish. A few months later, the Queen died. Frederick was not allowed to attend her funeral. This was the daily reality of the British elite. Unimaginable wealth, the power of a growing global empire, the finest silk clothes, and the most beautiful country estates. And they spent their days plotting against their own blood, stewing in a toxic soup of resentment, completely incapable of having a normal, boring family dinner. But as the century turned, the Hanoverian dysfunction shifted. It stopped being petty, and it started being profoundly tragic. Let's drift forward to George III. George III actually broke the curse, initially. He loved his wife, Queen Charlotte. They had 15 children. He was a faithful husband, which was a miracle by Hanoverian standards. He didn't want to be a glamorous conqueror. He liked agriculture. He was known as Farmer George. His ideal day was walking around his estates, chatting with the local farmers about crop rotation, and eating boiled mutton. But George III had a ticking time bomb in his genetics. We still debate today exactly what it was. Some historians believe it was a blood disorder called porphyria. Modern psychiatrists lean more towards severe bipolar disorder. Whatever it was, it completely destroyed his mind. His first major bout of madness struck in 1788. The king of the British Empire suddenly started talking incredibly fast. He would talk for hours, non-stop, until he foamed at the mouth and his voice gave out. He claimed he saw angels. He tried to plant a stake in the ground, believing it would grow into a beef tree. He became violent toward his servants. And because he was the king, the medical response was swift, brutal, and completely useless. The royal doctors had no idea what to do with mental illness, so they fell back on torture, basically. They believed the king's brain was overheated. To cool it down, they covered his legs in mustard plasters, thick pastes that literally blistered and burned the skin. They gave him heavy doses of arsenic and tartar emetic, which caused violent, endless vomiting. When the king, completely understandably, fought back against this torment, they brought in a specialist named Dr. Francis Willis. Willis's primary treatment for a mentally ill monarch was intimidation. He brought a straitjacket. Imagine the absolute, terrifying vulnerability. The most powerful man in the world, the king who lost America, the man whose face was on every coin. He was wrestled to the ground by his own servants, strapped into a canvas jacket, and tied to a chair. For days at a time, he just sat there in a dark room in Q Palace, babbling incoherently, his legs covered in chemical burns, his urine turned blue from the medication, completely lost in the terrifying maze of his own broken mind. He recovered from that first bout, but the madness always came back, and his final decade was a long, slow descent into the dark. By the end of his life, George III was completely blind, entirely deaf, and permanently insane. He wandered the halls of Windsor Castle in a stained purple dressing gown, holding conversations with people who had been dead for 50 years. He would sit at a harpsichord and play beautiful, heartbreakingly sad melodies for hours, tears streaming from his blind eyes. His son, the Prince Regent, took over the country, and true to the Hanoverian tradition, the son completely ignored his sick father. The old king was just left there, a ghost haunting his own palace, waiting for an end that took a very, very long time to arrive. It is the ultimate sobering contrast. We started this journey looking at early humans, wandering the hot savannas, digging for roots, their days consumed by the simple, endless quest for calories. They were vulnerable to predators, to the weather, to a broken ankle. And then humanity evolved. We built farms. We built massive stone temples. We crowned living gods in Egypt and terrified autocrats in Mesopotamia. We built the marble forums of Rome, the damp castles of the Middle Ages, the suffocating, glittering cage of Versailles, and the refined, petty palaces of Georgian London. We invented agriculture, writing, bureaucracy, and empire. We insulated ourselves with wealth, with armies, and with the divine right of kings. And yet, at the very top of that pyramid, surrounded by all that power and all that gold, what did the elite actually do all day? They suffered. They ground their teeth down on stone grit. They hid from eclipses. They drank poisoned medicine. They strapped themselves into iron pajamas because they thought they were made of glass. They choked on their own large tongues, leaked soup out of their noses, and strapped their fathers into straitjackets. No matter how many walls we build or how many crowns we wear, we are still just biological machines trying to navigate a very confusing world. The daily life of an emperor wasn't really that much better than the daily life of a hunter-gatherer. It was just different. It had softer pillows, sure, but it also had vastly more complicated, far more expensive ways to be completely miserable. So as we bring this long, strange journey to a close, you can take a little bit of comfort in your own life. You don't have to wake up and have a crowd of men argue over who gets to hand you your shirt. You don't have to worry about the Duke of Newcastle thinking you want to murder him at a christening. And you don't have to walk for 8 hours in the hot sun just to eat a fibrous tuber that tastes like dirt. You can just lie there, in a warm bed, with a roof over your head that probably isn't leaking, and plumbing that definitely isn't just a hole over a moat. The empires have all fallen. The pharaohs are dust. The Sun King has set. The day is over, and the long walk is finally done. It is time to let the history fade away. Let the marble columns crumble, and let the velvet curtains close. Just breathe, nice and slow. I hope you found a little peace in the dysfunction of the past. Rest your eyes. Let your mind drift. Good night, guys. Sleep well.